Well, thank you, Matt, and good evening, everyone. It's very nice to be with you here this evening. And the topic that we're going to address is a fairly large one. So this will be a 30,000-foot view of material culture along the James. And I'm going to use a few questions to get us started as we go. But first of all, let's talk about the region we'll be addressing. And really, it is not the entire James, but the lower James River, from Norfolk to Richmond. And as you can see, there are several cities that figure prominently in what we'll be talking about tonight. But what they all have in common is their adjacency to the James River, a tidal river that gave direct access to the Atlantic Ocean and meant that at every one of these cities, and in fact at most of the farms and plantations along the river, there was direct access to Europe and to Africa and to South America. And all of that played into the character of the region. We're going to talk principally about furniture and to some extent about ceramics and silver, but I will warn you ahead of time that I am a brown furniture person, and this is going to be a lot of furniture. So bear with us as we move through the topic here. It's always well to ask questions when one frames a discussion, and the first one is, why isn't more material from this region found in museums and collections across the eastern United States? And one of the answers is fire. Now, there was never as much of this material as there was in the Northeast, but fire and war have taken a serious toll on what was done in this part of the world. On January 1st, 1776, the city of Norfolk, which was the largest city in the colony, was completely destroyed by fire, burnt literally to the ground. And in fact, today, only one colonial-era building still stands, and it is a shell that was rebuilt in the 19th century. As late as 20 years after the fire, you can still see Benjamin Henry Latrobe's illustration of the outskirts of Norfolk, still in ruins. And nearly a decade after the fire, one observer said, "Such a vast heap of ruins and devastation are almost impossible to have any idea of unless seen." And sadly, the same things happened in Hampton and in Richmond during the Civil War. In 1862, the entire city of Hampton, which was a prosperous river port, was completely destroyed by fire. And again, the only buildings that survive are those that were rebuilt within brick walls. Most of the city was lost at that time. And in Richmond in 1865, a substantial portion of the city went up in flames. Ironically, both of these fires were set not by Union troops, but by the Confederates, who were determined that these cities would not fall into Union hands. Talk about cutting off your nose to spite your face, said the guy from Virginia. Demographics also impacted directly how much was produced. Now, when you think about the way the colonies were settled and look at the northern part of what is now the United States, while there was certainly an agricultural economy, there were also very large cities that were formed early on. They grew substantially, and for example, by 1800, Philadelphia was one of the largest English-speaking cities in the world. By contrast, in the South, and particularly in the area we're discussing today, it was a completely agricultural society from the 17th century on. Much of that work was upon the backs of men and women enslaved for life, and principally it was tobacco. Beginning in the 17th century, tobacco made many, many people incredibly wealthy, and that really worked against the establishment of large towns because the tobacco could be shipped directly from river ports right in the adjacent farms and plantations. And in fact, there are documented stories of the Jamestown settlement, which was the first capital of the colony of Virginia, literally having tobacco planted in the streets because it was so profitable. In the 1750s, Virginia begins to shift to a wheat culture, which is far less labor-intensive, but also, like tobacco, is directly aimed at being shipped abroad, so that agricultural economy stays. And of course, we know that the production of things like furniture and silver tends to be in urban centers, and when there are fewer urban centers, there are fewer craftsmen. Demographics also shaped the way objects looked because so much of what was being made in this part of the world was either produced by recent British immigrants or by those born in the colony or later the state who were trained by British immigrants, whether they were white or black or free or enslaved. So that kept reinforcing itself as we went along. And as a consequence, the materials that are made in this part of the world really don't look much like those from other parts of colonial America. The Massachusetts colony, by the 1770s, had fourth-generation cabinet makers. They had been trained by men who had been trained by men who had been trained by men who were trained in Massachusetts. Whereas in Virginia, most of what was being made in this earlier part was the work of recent immigrants. And so you get furniture that looks exactly like that was being produced in Britain at the same time. Starting in the 17th century, we see this pattern going along. The wonderful and famous court cupboard in the Mesda collection, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts on the left, so similar to contemporary examples from Britain. The pieces and parts get moved around, but it's the same general concept. And in fact, if you look at things like turning patterns and joinery patterns, they're almost always mimicked very, very closely. Look at the high chair on the right and that ball and ring turning pattern, and compare it to the ball and ring turnings on the legs of the Virginia table to the left. These are simply artisans who got off the boat and continued to do what they had done before. And while this table is a replica of the one in the kitchen at Shirley Plantation on the James, it's a Virginia-made table. The original is fragmentary at this point, and it looks exactly like a refectory table from an English university. The columnar turnings are coming right out of architectural patterns of that same period, and so you see that this continues as we go forward. Now, believe it or not, there is some French influence in this part of the world. I'm sure you know that in 1688, the Edict of Nantes was repealed, and that led to the direct fleeing of many, many French Huguenots. We all think of them as landing in the Carolina Lowcountry, but a number of them also came to southeastern Virginia, and we see that heritage reflected in objects like these chairs. If you look in the center at that portrait by David, you see the end of a cradle with the very same structural and decorative patterns that we see in these chairs made in southeastern Virginia. A number of them survive, and they're made right up into the end of the 18th century. And we see it in some cabinet work as well. On the right side is a piece called a buffet bas from Quebec. It's a French form. And on the left rather, is an example that was made along the James River, probably in Surrey or Sussex County, right at the end of the 18th, or the 17th, or the beginning of the 18th century. But those were the exceptions. In fact, what we know is that in Eastern Virginia, English sold. We see it in the advertisements of artisans making furniture for decades in the 18th century. James Wilson, carver from London, makes all kinds of ornaments in Williamsburg. Benjamin Bucktrout, cabinet maker from London, makes all sorts of cabinet work, either plain or ornamental. It comes again and again. And one of my favorite ads is by an artisan named McAllister, who first shows up from Ireland in Baltimore and advertises that he is late from London. But by the time he gets to Norfolk, he is suddenly, late from Dublin. By the time he gets to Norfolk, he's late from London, because London sold. You can see this very clearly when you begin comparing objects from both sides of the Atlantic. The desk and bookcase on the left is the work of Grace Coxed and Thomas Worcester about 1720. The one on the other side was made by Peter Scott in Williamsburg about 5 years later. Now, Scott is from Scotland, but probably was trained in London. And although the object on the left is a great deal more ornamental, if you visually extract all of that ornament and look at the form, it's bang on. The cornice profile, the panel profiles in the doors, the applied moldings on the side of the case, the fenestration of the drawers, and if I could show you the interior of the writing surface on the Virginia piece, it's exactly the same as the London model. This was also a time when what was called then the neat and plain style begins to be introduced by immigrating British artisans into the colony. In the 18th century, the word neat is defined as, and this is from a dictionary, free from what is unbecoming, unnecessary, or tawdry. I love that definition. And so you see orders being placed by people in the Chesapeake region that are directly referencing it. Charles Carroll of Maryland in 1767, sending to his factor in London, says, "I would have the goods of the best sorts, the furniture of the neat, plain fashion, nothing of the whimsical or Chinese taste, which I abominate." And just 5 years later, in Virginia, Robert Beverley ordering furniture again from the UK. "The furniture, I beg, may be as neat and plain as possible." In fact, he had early written a letter saying, "I have been some time in developing a house, and as I would have everything of the neat and plain fashion, I would willingly consult the present taste." The point is that the plain style was not an economic decision, it was a fashion statement in this part of the world, and it's directly mimicking the things that were being made not for the nobility in England, but for the gentry, people at about the same socioeconomic level. That plain style emphasizes clean lines, minimal ornament, and very good proportions, almost always based on mathematical proportioning systems. And you can see very close relationships between these things. The table on the left was made again by Peter Scott in Williamsburg. The one on the right is a British example, and the similarities are fairly straightforward here. Scott does it over and over again. He's making furniture in Williamsburg for an amazing 53 years, but he doesn't really change much after he gets here. And if you took any one of these Williamsburg tables and offered it for sale today in a London shop, no one would question that it was British. It's only the the North American secondary woods, and sometimes the primaries, that give them away as American pieces. Scott's case furniture is exactly the same. These all look like desks and bookcases that I've seen any number of times in English houses and antique shops today. I have to say about Peter that once he got here, he was pretty darn consistent. Over 5 decades, he hardly changes his style at all. And of course, lots of others were doing this as well. The desk and bookcase on the right was made in Williamsburg by an artisan who we haven't been able to identify yet. The one on the left screen is right out of an English antique shop a few years ago. The glazing patterns, the pediment patterns, the fenestration of the drawers, it's just English made in America. Anthony Hay, another British cabinet maker, probably from Scotland as well, but in Williamsburg by 1749, simply continuing to do what he had learned to do on the other side of the Atlantic. The same foot forms, the same table forms, even things like the upholstery evidence that we see on the chairs following the English prototypes at the same time. Hay's documented desk and bookcase on the left, made in 1753, even the joinery, the way the glue blocks are applied, the way the feet are blocked from behind, the dust boards inserted into the cases, all exactly the same kind of construction we see in England. And by this time, for example, in Boston, cabinet making patterns for construction in particular have moved vastly away from those English patterns. So it's easy to spot these things once you know what to look for. Seating furniture follows along in the same way. These chairs from Williamsburg and from Norfolk are just like patterns that we see pretty regularly in mid-range shops in the UK. And down the river in Norfolk, the same thing is happening. This clothes press and chest of drawers were made in 1775 by John Selden for the Carter family at Shirley Plantation. All the same things I've been saying apply here: outward details, inward construction. And if you have any doubts about the British inspiration, look at this plate from Chippendale's director in 1754. Selden must have owned a copy of this because it's followed right down to the indented corners on the paneled doors in the top of the clothes press. Indeed, the presence of a clothes press is another one of those illustrations. Our friends to the north in this period really favored the what we call the high boy or the high chest of drawers in New England, or the chest on chest in the middle colonies at this period. But those were forms that had gone out of fashion in England about 30 to 40 years earlier. The current most popular form for clothing and textile storage in Britain was the clothes press, and so that's exactly what the Virginians are using as well. In Norfolk, the pitch pediment that is coming right off of British models is popular and is seen over and over again. On the right, a piece signed by Robert Wilkins that is in the Mesda collection. The other two pieces by two different Norfolk artisans. We don't know exactly who, but there's no question about the fact that they are simply made by people who are closely tied to British artisans. Now, Wilkins, we know, is trained by another artisan in Norfolk earlier, but the British connection there is the same. And it's not just the detailing, it's the forms. I bet you've not seen one of these before. This is work that Sumter Pretty discovered a few years ago. This is a Scottish furniture form whereby the doors open, a writing surface falls down, and there are two of these that have Norfolk histories. And I should probably mention that a surprising number of the artisans working in places like Norfolk and Williamsburg were not English necessarily, but Scottish. There were lots of Scottish artisans in the eastern South, and that's true of Charleston, South Carolina as well, by the way. Tea tables following the same model. This Norfolk table has that great baluster and ring turning that we see often in Virginia. We also see it in Newport, Rhode Island, but it's very common in Britain. Now, there's not as much to go on in Richmond in this pre-revolutionary era because, as you heard from Calder, the city's considerably younger than Norfolk is. But when we do find things that can be dated before the Revolutionary War, they follow these same patterns. These two tables, probably the work of George Donald, another Scottish cabinet maker, show standard neat and plain detailing. And when you get out of the cities into the countryside, we're following those same models. The chair on the far right there attributed to a Quaker, Samuel Cornwell in Southampton County. The table on the other side here from probably Isle of Wight or Sussex or Surrey County. And then that remarkable corner cupboard in the center with its original turned ball feet and Prussian blue paint. And the indented corners in the top two panes there follows a pattern that we see in southwestern England, and we don't see it anywhere else. Let's ask another question. Are there exceptions to this neat and plain pattern that we see along the James? Yeah, they're pretty exceptional, aren't they? There's a whole group of china tables that have histories in eastern Virginia that are probably the work of an artisan in Williamsburg. The one on the left descended in the Bird family and is made of black walnut. There is no question that it was made in eastern Virginia. And the one on the right is one of 4 rectangular examples and 2 additional serpentine examples. The ones on the right are a group that are made in 2 different ways. In some of them, the carving is applied, and in others, it is cut from the solid, but they are all coming from the same pattern. They all appear to be the work of the same artisan, and there's been question about whether they might be English. But my question would be, how do you find 4 nearly identical ornate china tables in eastern Virginia that all get imported rather than being made locally? One of these tables belonged to George and Martha Washington in Mount Vernon. The other one was owned in Gloucester County, just across the York River from Williamsburg. And there are also exceptions in ceremonial chairs. The one on the left was made by Benjamin Bucktrout, a British artisan who shows up in Williamsburg in the 1760s, made for an unidentified Masonic lodge in eastern Virginia, but with its legs coming directly from Chippendale's director, and the back covered with emblems that are meaningful in the Masonic following. It's the only piece of signed Williamsburg furniture that's known at this point. The one on the right made by another Williamsburg artisan for the Williamsburg Masonic Lodge and still owned by them to this day. But like the china tables, both of these chairs have ceremonial functions, and that may well be the reason that we abandon the neat and plain and go to something considerably more elaborate for these kinds of objects. Are there any influences from other colonies in this pre-revolutionary period? Not too many, but there are some. The table in the center and the one on the right were both made in Norfolk, but if you look at the example on the left from the Connecticut River Valley, I think you can see where the influence is coming from. In fact, if we could take the drawers out of the Virginia tables, you would see that it is absolutely standard issue New England construction, and I think this is almost certainly an artisan who has moved from the Connecticut Valley to the James River Valley in the 1740s or 50s. But again, these are the exceptions rather than the rule. Now, after the Revolution, these patterns really begin to change, and that is partly to do with the growth of cities. Richmond, as you've heard from Calder, explodes in growth. A tremendous amount of construction is going on, and it's the center of a great deal of commerce in Virginia. And Norfolk in the 1790s, as you see in this watercolor by Latrobe, is also growing considerably. Even though much of the city was still in ruins, look at the number of masts in the harbor at this point. That doesn't mean that we abandon the British taste. It lingers. In fact, in many cases, it's the work of artisans who were here before the Revolution, are either British immigrants themselves or were trained by such. And you see it in all three of these pieces, which we know were made after the Revolution. On the far right, a clothes press made in Williamsburg in 1795. The bill of sale survives. On the left, a piece made in James City County near Williamsburg by John Hockaday. The matching chest of drawers with its bill of sale from 1805 also survives. And a piece by Arthur Mann here in the Richmond area in the decades immediately after the Revolutionary War. Except for the hardware, they looked like they were made in the 1760s or 70s. But we also continue to see surprising numbers of British artisans immigrating after the Revolutionary War. Now, I think a lot of us assume that immigration stops from the UK, or what we call the UK today, after the war, but it couldn't be further from the truth. They're still coming over in substantial numbers. So the secretary and bookcase in the center, made by a Scottish immigrant called Thomas McAllister in Norfolk, looks exactly like urban British furniture of the 1780s. The two chests of drawers made in Norfolk, deceptive in this picture. They're actually enormous chests of drawers that are just like the English ones being made in the 1790s. And like the furniture we discussed earlier, the construction on the inside is exactly in line with what's happening in the UK. Even those beautiful French feet have horizontal glue blocks behind them because that's more structurally sophisticated than putting a vertical grain behind them, but that's what's continuing to happen. And in Virginia, corner cupboards are normally the work of carpenters rather than cabinet makers. They tend to be made of secondary woods and they tend to be painted, and they don't tend to be in the best rooms in the house. But in Norfolk, after the Revolutionary War, someone is making very sophisticated mahogany veneered corner cupboards. There are 4 of them here. I could show you 7 or 8 more, and they are remarkably sophisticated. Clearly, they are not kitchen furniture, and they look exactly like English corner cupboards of the same period. But there are new influences coming. The Revolutionary War did tremendous economic damage to the major seaports of the Northeast. The harbors had been bottled up for much of the war. Soldiers were slow in coming back. Many had lost their lives. And so a lot of interesting things begin to happen. First of all, we start to see quantities of material being shipped south from cabinet-making shops in coastal New England, New York, Pennsylvania. And here are just 3 examples. The tall case clock on the left is labeled by William McCabe of Richmond, but even the most basic beginner in clock studies can look at the interior, at the movement, at the white pine secondaries, and tell you this is the work of the Willard shop in Roxbury or Boston. There's no question about it. In the center is a New York City chair, one of a set of 14 that is still sitting in the Moses Myers house in Norfolk, where it's been since the late 18th century. And on the far right is a New England secretary and bookcase that is also original to the Myers house in Norfolk. And in fact, if you go to the John Marshall house in Richmond, you'll see its near twin, which is also original to that house. This is furniture that was called venture cargo in the period. It was being packed and shipped south and offered for sale. And there's a wonderful letter from a Massachusetts ship captain back to his Massachusetts cabinet maker in 1805 saying, "I have been to Richmond. I have tried to sell the furniture. It did not go." Quote, "It did not go because there was a ship here from New York last week and sold things very low. I will reload the furniture and try the next port." And so when they say venture, that's what they mean. And most of the time it tends to be the plainer materials because they're familiar with the taste in this part of the world. These two chairs here, these two pieces here, both were originally owned in coastal North Carolina, but they too are imports from the north. They tend to be on the plainer side, and that's what we see here. The secretary and bookcase on the left, curiously, made very inexpensively. I suspect most of you are familiar with the practice of putting green silk curtains behind the glazed bookcase doors. Under the microscope, we found that this bookcase was not backed with green silk. It was backed with paper that had been painted green. That was the cut rate approach. And a lot of the Virginia cabinet makers were not very happy about these imports. John DeJarnett, a cabinet maker in nearby Petersburg, Virginia, complained in a newspaper piece in 1816, could the subscriber meet with sufficient encouragement, it would enable him to advance our own market by giving the most approved workmen such prices as are given in New York and Philadelphia for the best work. They were feeling the squeeze. And what's interesting is that as this period progresses, a lot of these artisans began to leave coastal areas like Norfolk and move inland where there was less competition from imports. The other thing that begins to happen is that you see a lot of migrating artisans coming from the north, and it's apparently something that's important enough to mention in the newspaper ads because apparently there's appeal. So in 1793, the cabinet-making firm of Hazen and Chamberlain in Norfolk advertises that they have hired, quote, or that they have, quote, practiced in the first shops in Philadelphia and New York. And 2 years later, James Woodward, a prolific Norfolk cabinet maker, advertises that he has hired, quote, the best workmen from Philadelphia and New York. And all of this begins to shape the way things look. Now, some of the earliest influences that you see are here in Richmond from Henry Ingle from Philadelphia. And in fact, Calder showed you those wonderful interiors on the Virginia State House. Much of that work was produced by this shop, not necessarily by Ingle directly, but by his employee, William Hodgson, who is an Irish carver who did the examples of carving that you see here. But if you look at the forms of those two desks, they look very much like contemporary Philadelphia furniture, both made here in Richmond. And the seating furniture is following along the same lines. On the far right there, that Norfolk chair is spot on from Philadelphia work of the same period. The next one over, made in the Woodward shop in Norfolk, looks like a New York City chair. The other two also following northern models. And on the far left here, a Norfolk cabinet table, card table rather, that is very much in the New York taste, with 5 legs rather than 4, just like in New York, and with the apron divided into panels as you see here. The only way we can certainly say that it's Norfolk and not New York is that its secondary woods are typical of Virginia, and the black detailing in the inlays is not black inlay. It's either pitch or mastic, which we see being used in Norfolk a great deal. The mate to this table recently came up for sale, by the way, and the very skillful dealer from whom we acquired this, Sumter Pretty, told me at one point years ago when we got this, that when he found it offered for sale by a prominent New York dealer, it was listed as New York City. And after Sumter had secured it and purchased it, he said, I have to tell you, this is not a New York table. And the dealer said, I know. And Sumter said, well, why did you mark it as New York? And the dealer said, well, New York sells. The table on the other side is also from Norfolk, signed by John D. Gieselin, who is a native of the area in 1819, has just come into the Williamsburg collection and is again following that 5-leg New York pattern. We also see examples like these secretary bookcases, both made in Norfolk in the early 19th century and looking very much like the same kind of form from the Northeast at the same date. And objects like this sofa follow that same pattern. It looks very much like a New York box sofa of the same period, but we know that it was made in Norfolk by Chester Sully, and yes, by the way, that is Thomas Sully's brother. He's the only one of the Sully siblings who did not go into the fine or performing arts, and that's Thomas Sully's portrait of him there, by the way. And you might even say, well, how do we know it isn't an imported New York sofa? Again, if you could take the upholstery off, it's typical Eastern Virginia construction, not an open frame for webbing, but completely paneled on the back and seat and then upholstered over. And by the way, except for the horsehair, that is all the original upholstery on this sofa. And also here in Richmond, you begin to see an interest in turned elements like these. The table on the left is labeled by an artisan called James Rockwood, and there is a turner in the city called Curtis Rockwood, who may well have been supplying legs to a variety of artisans who are working here in the city. And you're fortunate tonight in having here in the audience Michael Phillips, who knows a great deal more about federal Richmond furniture than anybody on the planet, so corner him at the reception there. Michael, you're turning red. This same influence continues on through the period, and you see it in the details of the turned feet on the Woodward clothes press that is signed and dated there in 1821. And that clothes press form continues to linger on here in Eastern Virginia. And you see it in details on the table in the center. These are looking more and more like pieces from New York and Philadelphia. And in fact, by the 1820s, the designs of furniture being made in this part of the world are becoming so homogenized with other American centers that it gets to be pretty hard to tell what's imported and what's made locally. Both of these pieces made in Norfolk, we can tie them to other local construction, and they're full of yellow pine secondaries, which is the work of that area. Now, let's talk a little bit about ceramics, and I do mean a little bit, because for one thing, like the rest of early America, most of the ceramics that were being used in the James Valley are imported from other parts of the world. But there is production locally, and I'm not going to say a great deal about this because you're going to get to hear from Rob Hunter later in the program, and Rob really knows more about this than anyone else. But in the very earliest decades of settlement on the James, near Jamestown in James City County, there was a potter called Thomas Ward who was making unglazed earthenwares. We find them archaeologically. We don't find them in above ground intact examples, but this is a small component of what's being used in the area. Archaeology tells us that the ceramics used in this part of the world in the 17th century are coming principally from England, but we also see examples from Italy and from Germany and from other parts of the world. Trade was more diverse than people often realize. And surprisingly, William Rogers in Yorktown ran a pottery in the second quarter of the 18th century, and it was amazing because he produced both earthenwares and stoneware. They are, again, archaeological. We don't find intact examples unless Rob has discovered one that I don't know about. And this was a much bigger production center than people realized. He was shipping it to other parts of the eastern seaboard. But at this time, production of goods like this was frowned upon by the British government because they wanted to do the production at home and collect the revenues from the colonists. So when the governor of Virginia was queried about this body of material, knowing full well that it was a going concern, he wrote back and basically said, it's not that big, don't worry about it. And then colonoware is a very important subject that a lot of us are beginning to study in much more detail. These are unglazed, low-fired earthenwares. They are almost invariably utilitarian wares like storage jars, cooking pots, and chamber pots. They are produced by both African American and Native American communities up and down the eastern seaboard, and they are ubiquitous. Archaeologically, we find them absolutely everywhere, but again, intact above-ground examples almost unknown. And then a really interesting subject that you'll hear about from Rob is the explosion of stoneware production here in Richmond in the early 19th century. The archaeology is absolutely nailing all of the evidence for this. These are just two of the concerns that were going, Benjamin Duval and John Schermerhorn. You'll see examples in museums here in Richmond and in private collections, and you saw some at Colonial Williamsburg when you were visiting there. But I will leave the rest of this story to my friend and colleague, Rob Hunter. In silver, much the same thing. Before the Revolutionary War, the overwhelming majority of silver used along the James was imported from England. It was a matter of economies of scale. It could simply be more economically produced in England and more easily acquired that way. Both of these coffee pots made in London, the one on the left owned by Robert Carter of Nominee Hall. The one on the right, owned by Peyton Randolph in Williamsburg. That's the norm for silver in this part of the world. Now, we do know that there is silver and goldsmithing going on in Virginia in the early 18th century. The documents are clear about that. And I can say that I actually know of one piece that was made in the early 18th century, but I'm not allowed to talk about it because it's privately owned. And if the word gets out, the price will go through the roof. But for the most part, there's not that much of it because, again, the silversmiths and goldsmiths got here. They were looking for gold early on. That was one of the hopes of the British investors, but very quickly realized that they could make a lot more money planting tobacco, and that's exactly what they did. When you get into the later colonial period, there are a few silversmiths working along the James. Alexander Kerr in Williamsburg in the early 18th century makes the chalice and paten on the left that are now the property of St. Paul's Parish in Edenton, North Carolina. And the salts in the center there were made in Norfolk by James Murphy in the middle of the 18th century. But again, like the furniture, these could pass easily for English silver of the same period. And really, in terms of silversmithing before the Revolution, hollowwares are a very, very small part of what's produced because what they're all doing is making flatware, principally spoons and ladles. We see it in Norfolk, we see it in Williamsburg, we see it in Richmond, we know it's being done in Hampton as well. They're just banging out spoons and selling imported hollowwares. After the Revolution, you start to see more hollowware production. These two images show work by William Richardson on the right and by William and his brother George on the left. They are both Virginia-born and Virginia-trained. And does the term neat and plain apply here as well? I think it probably does. But you also continue to see immigrant silversmiths coming from across the pond. Jeremiah Andrews is from England, but in addition to working in London, he also was in New York and in Philadelphia, and even sold things in Savannah before landing in Norfolk, where he spent the rest of his life. This is one of his examples, and again in that plain style, but he also was capable of more interesting forms. And when you start looking at his work, you begin to see how he's picking up elements from each of the places where he's worked. So the tea service on the right, made about 1800 for members of the Stone family in Norfolk, includes the waste bowl at the bottom, which has an absolutely standard issue Philadelphia border at the top there. And remember, he had worked in Philadelphia. And interestingly, the coffee pot that goes with this suite and descended with it and bears Jeremiah Andrews' mark also bears the mark of John Shank in New York City, who actually made the pot. And it was imported to Norfolk, and Andrews acquired it, probably did the engraving with the couple's initials, and then sold it and added his own marks to it as well. Matthew Clough, again, from the other side of the Atlantic, and really with Irish influences beginning to be apparent here. And then I have to show you my favorite piece of Virginia silver in the center, made by the firm of Johnson and Reet, this racing trophy that stands almost 15 inches tall, made for a race in 1811, still in the family that owned the horse in 1811, and on loan to Colonial Williamsburg. Truly outstanding object. But look at the adjacent cream pot by the same firm. Can you see where the trophy form is coming from? So you get a lot more hollowware being produced in this part of the world at this point, but it never reaches the same volume that we see in the Northeast. Now, there's so much more to talk about with material culture in the James Valley. I haven't touched on textiles, but they are abundant. The quilt on the right, made in 1857 by the women and girls of the Lee Street Baptist Church for their new pastor. The Lee Street Baptist Church is still standing today and still has an active congregation. And on the left, one of my favorite quilts made in Norfolk, not perhaps for its color and its pattern, which are beautiful, but for the name of its maker. And yes, her name was Fanny Butt. I'll leave it there. Needlework in this part of the world also very interesting to explore. There are many, many samplers, and the one on the left is a great example made outside the city of Norfolk in Norfolk County in 1811. And the just discovered needlework picture on the right, made here in Richmond about 1800, in nearly pristine condition, one of three that descended from the same young woman, Sarah Radford. It's still in the family, and they've been in a box for about 100 years, which is why they are not faded. They are not shattered from light damage. I'm trying to talk the owner into giving them to Colonial Williamsburg, and I think I'm going to win that one. The English influences that we talked about in furniture and other things are here as well. You see it not only in the needlework picture, but in the samplers. Look at the back of this sampler. Like most English samplers of this same period, the back is as neat as the front. That is not the case with New England samplers or those from Pennsylvania. There is this rigid focus on really exquisite finishing of everything and anything that comes along. And then there's the whole subject of portraiture. I'm kind of a portrait geek, and the ones that you'll see in Eastern Virginia along the James are truly wonderful. And I'll just mention these four. On the far left here is William Prentice by Charles Bridges. Bridges shows up in the 1730s in Williamsburg, paints up and down the James. He really comes over because of his interest in the Society for I'm going to get this wrong, the propagation of the gospel. But he is written about in the period as a man who also has to earn his bread by painting. That particular portrait, wonderful, because the young man who came over as an apprentice to a local merchant in Williamsburg ends up owning the firm. And this is a portrait of him. The next one over by John Durand, that's Elizabeth Carr. If you've heard the name Durand before, you probably recognize it from New York City and Connecticut, where he was painting in the 1760s. He's in Virginia by 1769, painting up into the early 1780s, up and down the James, as far up the river as Dinwiddie County. And in fact, those of you who went to see the Campbell's collection today, you may have noticed a painting leaning against the kitchen table. They've just acquired it. That is the work of John Durand as well, of a young 14-year-old girl from Dinwiddie. And one over from that, that's Anne Barrade of Norfolk, painted by Henry Benbridge in 1800. Many of you will know the name Benbridge from Charleston because he painted extensively there before the Revolutionary War. But after the war, as his health was failing, he moved to Norfolk where his son was living and painted several really amazing portraits like this one of Anne Barrade. And then finally, Cephas Thompson. Cephas Thompson is an amazing artist. He is actually a resident of Rhode Island, but every winter he goes south and he keeps a list of all the portraits he paints, and it survives. So in 1811, 1812, he was in Norfolk. He also painted in the winters in Alexandria and in Richmond and in Charleston and in New Orleans. And unlike many other artists of the day, his are really accurate likenesses of the people that he's seeing because he often includes warts and all. There's so much more that could be said about this, but I know you've had a chance to visit the art museums of Colonial Williamsburg. There's a lot more to be seen there. There are wonderful things in the collection of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. You'll see great Richmond furniture in the John Marshall House and in the Wickham House, and I hope you'll keep looking at it and keep asking questions. And I thank you for your attention tonight. Thank you.